So I know a number of you in the room from the reconciliation movement, which I still count myself as part of, which is lovely to see some familiar faces. And Mark, of course, we were younger and much more beautiful, but we continue to be engaged. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement, obviously, as a matter of protocol, as a mark of respect, to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, and thank them for their care of country over many generations. So Peter mentioned that I'm a native title lawyer and previously worked for the Aboriginal Land Council, but I'd like to think I was one of those young people who, as I left school, faced 10 years of the Howard government, and luckily at that time it was when the reconciliation movement during the time of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation was thriving in the mid-90s, and it was a movement that I could get involved in as a young activist, and I feel like I grew up in the reconciliation movement. And I say that because I think it's very important when we look at some of the criticisms of Recognise, and they are important to engage with if we're actually going to get there. And they're criticisms, I think, a lot of them for those of us in the left who are in the movement, about whether we're going in the right direction and whether this is a useful path. Is this worth our time in terms of our aim for social justice and to progress Indigenous rights in this country? They're really serious questions, but they strike me that they're a lot of the same questions that we got asked and we asked ourselves when we were involved in the reconciliation movement. Questions around, does this compete with treaty? Does it undermine sovereignty? Are we compromising? Are we telling people that this history doesn't matter and we just need to hold hands and be nice to each other? And the role that conservative governments and conservative commentators played in trying to push it in a particular direction, because what we were doing was important and was threatening to that kind of agenda, is some of the things what I think we need to remember when we look at the criticisms that we're raising about each other being involved in the Recognise movement. So I wanted to just Mark gave a great overview of the history, but I wanted to give a little bit of the political background before going into some of those more specific, examining some of those specific criticisms. So people might remember that the referendum kind of process, the most recent one, has come out 2010 when the Greens and Independents were in minority government with the Labor Party, and it was part of the agreement to support the Labor government that there be a referendum, and that it happened in 2013, which is when the next federal election was planned. And so there was an expert panel on constitutional recognition, and that was co-chaired by who is now one of our new Labor senators for Western Australia, Pat Dodson, which I think is wonderful as such a champion for reconciliation. And that was the first of the kind of community consultations that happened, and then a report was delivered to government. Now, that report, I think, was the start of when there were real questions about what the question might be, but also whether or not constitutional recognition was going to compete with the idea of sovereignty. Because that expert panel recommended some very strong things around putting a protection against racial discrimination in the Constitution, but also and recognising Aboriginal people, but it didn't recognise that Aboriginal ownership would be included in the Constitution. It talked about recognising occupation, but not ownership. And it specifically looked at the questions of treaty and sovereignty and said, no, we don't recommend that that's the direction we go in terms of this constitutional recognition process. So the Racial Discrimination Act aspects are incredibly important because currently, obviously, we have a Racial Discrimination Act in Australia since 1975, and some of the only times it's ever been switched off by the Parliament, because the Parliament created it, it's legislation, it's not like the Constitution, was to hurt Aboriginal people. It was switched off in the Hindmarsh Island Bridge case in 1997, and that was because Aboriginal cultural heritage was getting in the way of development. It was switched off in the Native Title Act, the 10-point plan, in 1998. These are all under the Howard government, in response to the wins that Aboriginal people had through native title in a series of cases. And it was switched off for the NT intervention the first time round. It's now been adjusted, so technically there's no breach of the RDA, but many of us would argue that it still was. So we do have a history of this country where we know that even where we have a Racial Discrimination Act, that's not a real protection, particularly for Aboriginal people. And it is notable also that each of the times that the government has decided to switch off the Racial Discrimination Act, it's been with the support of both the major parties, and it's also been specifically to undermine access to land and water and control of Aboriginal land and water, gains that have been very hard won by Aboriginal people. So that it's no small thing that this discussion about including a racial discrimination protection in the Constitution is no small thing, and it's a very strong recommendation, and it's really important to mention, as well as obviously the stuff we're talking about of recognition that Aboriginal people were the prior owners or occupiers or traditional owners, whatever we end up the question being. So I think it's interesting, and it is important to talk about why it is that after that political process back in 2012 when the report was handed down, some of the arguments about why there wasn't a stronger recognition argument, why you wouldn't put to the people that Aboriginal ownership should be recognised in the Constitution. And the argument of the panel at the time was, one, well, it needs to get bipartisan support. That was one of the terms of reference for the expert panel being set up, and people were pretty realistic about the fact they didn't think that was going to happen. And that's remarkable because currently in the common law of this country, the native title cases mean that our common law recognises that Aboriginal people did own Australia, own or custodianship, legally. It's part of our common law. It's recognised in the Native Title Act, even though the Native Title Act then waters down and minimises and attempts to restrict, so practically, the way Aboriginal people can exercise that ownership. But it's in those laws, and it's in some of our state laws. So the preamble to the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act, for example, which is also 30 years old, it's not a new piece of legislation, is that land in New South Wales was traditionally owned and occupied by Aboriginal people. So it wasn't a recommendation that was supported, but at the time the discussion was clear that compromises needed to be made if we were going to get something through, and that's a real part of deciding that some of the criticisms around the recognition campaign are around the tactics about whether this is actually something that is a distraction from or is moving us closer towards genuine recognition and rights for Indigenous people in this country. So that argument, we need bipartisan support, which of course didn't turn out to be the case anyway, because it was the Abbott government at the time and they were never going to provide support, and they didn't. And then the lack of support, as well as the need for more community consultation that Mark mentioned, was from a political point of view why it was then put off to another process. There was supposed to be, if there was a re-elected Labor government, that there would be a kind of interim recognition act in the Parliament, but of course it didn't happen because the Conservatives were elected. And then that put us on this path now to the recognised process. Now, and in terms of, from my point of view, about whether I support the recognition process, I support constitutional change, but I do think that it's important to examine some of the criticisms, because I think we can end up undermining something incredibly valuable if we don't understand where they come from and also talk about how we address them. And this is where I think there are great lessons to be learnt from the reconciliation movement. So the first big criticism that there is about the recognised process is that somehow it is opposed to sovereignty. So to unpack that a bit, obviously the word recognise in itself is not a terribly strong word. I recognise you exist. Okay, thanks, that's excellent. The idea of, it's not exactly something that is a strong, inspiring, rights-based kind of motivation. And I think that's important because during the reconciliation movement process, during the formal Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, there was a big discussion about the word reconciliation and whether it was too soft. And you might remember that whole thing about the Howard government trying to reclaim that word and talk about practical reconciliation was a recognition that the word had some strength and it was coming to mean something, and then it needed to be reclaimed and dumbed down and redefined. So it's true that title recognise is not very, very strong, but we need to think about who it is we are letting define the use of that language and what we mean when we say that word. So that criticism, though, that somehow putting a recognition like that to something that just recognises Aboriginal people as, say, the traditional, not owners but occupiers of Australia, whether that somehow undermines the sovereignty argument, takes us further away from treaty. One of the better critiques I've heard, Celeste Little, who's a feminist writer, talks about is that her argument, as I hope I'm paraphrasing this correctly, is that if you put something weak like that in the Constitution, that is basically a submission. It's an act of assimilation by Indigenous people. It's them saying, well, yeah, we're happy with that. We're happy just to be recognised as this little lowly thing. And that somehow will undermine any future sovereignty claims. The way I've heard that translated, unfortunately, when you hit forums on the ground, is I see people genuinely stressed who say, hang on, I've heard that, if we're recognised in the Constitution, that will legally block us from ever having a treaty and ever having true sovereignty in this country. And that's incredibly dangerous, and we need to be careful with that. But that real question about will this be a submission, I think avoids the huge other question, which is, are we going to get the racial discrimination protection? And that is something real. That is something that at the moment is being used to effectively block the form of treaties that we have in this country, which is through the Native Title Act. We have this huge diversity of different arrangements that are happening across the country, and some of them, Mick Gooder talks about them being a form of treaty in the sense if you were to have a treaty, a lot of the content would be the same. It would be about who gets to access the land, who gets to control it, who gets to develop it, who gets to make money out of it. There are those arrangements being made across this country currently under the guise of native title, and one of the reasons they are not as strong as they should be is because the government is able to racially discriminate against Aboriginal people. And so it concerns me that there are real arguments around, the symbolism of those things, but the real practical effect will come from that race discrimination change, and that's still on the books. And for us to spend our time on the left with the symbolism of that argument and ignore the real practicality of what is still possibly an important change that we might be able to get up would be shooting ourselves in the foot and would be entirely counterproductive. So I feel like whenever I have those debates that I feel like the terms of what's being set is being narrowly defined in a way that would suit the people who oppose recognition, that want us talking about this and fighting with each other and trying to get the perfect question, as opposed to doing what we tried to do during the reconciliation movement, and I think we had a fair amount of success with, was to recognise there was an attempt to set the definition of the debate here, when really we wanted the debate to be here and to have it on our own terms. Maybe there was a forum being organised and it was a government organised forum and we wanted it to be more grassroots. Well, you'd turn up to that forum, or you'd make sure you were one of the speakers, and you would use that opportunity to talk about those issues. One thing about the reconciliation movement people, obviously it was not ultimately successful in the sense that the council handed down its report, we had the huge bridge walk, and then under a racist conservative government, the recommendations didn't get implemented. But that education process and the work that Recognise is doing now, the grassroots movement that rose up around that and used that tool and used the opportunity and hooked themselves onto this national debate, that's the reason, for example, I think when the Stolen Generation report came down, there was a network of people who could mobilise and help get that information out there. And that was incredibly important to do things like support the fact that it's now part of our primary school curriculum. It didn't matter that there was a Conservative government and ultimately the formal goals of the movement failed in that sense that specific recommendations weren't implemented. The movement had taken the bits that it wanted to and used them for its best, its actual purposes. And part of what the Recognise movement is, I feel, was already been valuable, regardless of whether we get to the question at the end, is that someone's actually funding public forums about Indigenous rights. Because frankly, that wouldn't happen otherwise. That all of the resources and public education that went into the reconciliation movement kind of drifted away or became a little more, I don't want to say corporatist, with the kind of focus on reconciliation action plans, but what was the formal organising and supporting of little groups locally to do their work and to be part of doing the public education and community education in their own communities disintegrated or went away just from a huge lack of support. And we're starting to see a bit of revival around that, and that's incredibly important. The debate we had around Invasion Day this year was so much more sophisticated than it has been for many years past, and I think that was because of this moment we're having and the work that's been done to bring us towards the constitutional recognition question. So to end in terms of, that's sort of a process thing, but to end in terms of whether or not we're going to get to this point where we actually have the question, and I got to be honest, I've really struggled about this because it could go one of several directions. We may get a very weak question, and do you want to, at the moment people are saying they're going to campaign against a weak question that may just, for example, if it was just a preamble that said Aboriginal people existed, that'd be pretty hard to get motivated to vote for, I don't know that I'd campaign against it actively, but it would be pretty hard to be inspired and get involved with. But if it was a question, even if it was not the best question about changing the Constitution in terms of recognition, but it was couched with something that was a racial discrimination protection, that would really have implications for, and that would be a genuine step towards treaty and sovereignty. that would absolutely be a genuine, practical, important, that would be a huge leap forward for this country. Whether or not it would lose momentum to put up a weak question and then have it fail, I don't know. I don't think I know the answer to that. I feel like so much has been invested so far in this process. There's already a lot of momentum. To drop out now or not even to get to the question, how demobilising would that be for the treaty movement? So I think we're in it now. We need to see it through, and our job is to make it a proper question, and our job is not to focus on the bits where we know we are going to lose, to be quite frank, which is getting a question which says Aboriginal people are the first owners of this country and there must be a framework for treaties. I would love it if that's what we were going to get. We're not going to get that in this constitution, but we may well win the race discrimination protection, and we may well win something stronger. And our job in that process then is to do what we do on the left when we're usually outgunned and we're dealing with a government that's more conservative than we want, is to reclaim and use and be flexible rather than just say it's not right, it's not perfect, we can't engage with that. I think that's our job, and therefore no matter what happens at the end, we will be able to look back and say it moved us further along the journey to genuine reconciliation in this country and genuine rights. Thank you.